welcome to Your Family Dog, a podcast dedicated to helping families love living with dogs. Here are your hosts, Julie Fudge Smith and Colleen Pelar.
Hi, welcome back to Your Family Dog, and this is part 2 of our episodes with Dr. Chris Pachel, a veterinary behaviorist in Oregon, right? That's where you are?
That is correct. I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. And we were talking about puppy socialization, and in our first episode, we talked a little bit about how puppies sometimes get traumatized when they have experiences that are more exposure than true socialization, the positive experience. But you've also noticed an interesting trend with arousal and exuberance related to socialization, and Julie and I are super excited to learn more about what you think about that.
Oh, I'm excited to share it. It's a pattern that I've noticed in quite a few of my patients, and just to kind of set the stage, most of the patients that I'm working with are not, they've been working with trainers or behavior consultants or they're veterinarians, and then at some point later on they've identified issues that need to be addressed. And where this one really comes into play is that I find is that when we go back to those early socialization experiences and we're asking clients, and pet owners, what did socialization look like for you? I'm finding that for a lot of these older dogs, and older just meaning, let's say 6, 9, months or older, I find that in many cases, they're not overly fearful. We didn't, necessarily have a lot of negative experiences early on. It looks like there should have been appropriate or sufficient socialization. But when we really dive in, what we're seeing is more of an exuberance or reactive pattern. And there's a level of hyper-arousal that I think, and this is very much experiential, and I don't have controlled data on this, so this is really more of an open discussion of theories and possible factors than it is saying this is this. But the pattern that I believe that we're seeing for some of these dogs is that if, let's say, we're socializing, we're exposing an 11-week-old or a 12-week-old or maybe even a 16-week-old pup to other puppies. And when we teach that pup through the way that we handle those interactions, that every, let's say, puppy-to-puppy interaction is an opportunity to, go say hi and let's give you a cookie so you see this as a positive thing, and it's puppy time and we're going to go play and we're going to go to the park and we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to do all of these things, we get this level of conditioned arousal that, gosh, if we pause for just a second and if we say, what are we teaching the pups? We're teaching them that the sight of another dog in this example is a trigger to ramp yourself up, all of that stuff. And so what ends up happening, I believe, is that we're creating a conditioned level of arousal that for sometimes with my clients, I often compare it to almost like the conditioning that a professional athlete might go through. Mm-hmm. Every time you hit the court or you hit the field, your body starts to kind of take on that. Yeah, you got to get ready. Let's hit the accelerator. Your brain is primed. Your adrenaline is just right there. It's like a car at the start lines, so to speak, just ready to go. And I think that for a lot of these pups, this conditioned arousal is fine, quote unquote, fine as puppies because they're playful, they're interactive, they're tiny. What we're doing is playtime. So we don't necessarily think anything of it at the time. It's when that Labrador puppy, let's say, is now 70 pounds,
dragging its
or
person toward the other dog.
Exactly.
Look, there's a dog.
Oh my gosh, this is the best day ever. And so we get this excitement and this exuberance that's there. And then all of a sudden we have other problems. And now we have, an adolescent who's quote unquote out of control, who was taught that seeing another dog is an invitation to approach. So now we've got inappropriate greetings. If the owner is strong enough or has the right tools to hold that dog back, now we have the potential to create frustration, which tips us into sort of a different level of arousal. And, it just creates a really, I find, interesting headspace for a lot of these dogs. And when I really trace it back to where I think we could have taken a different path, it's through a lot of those early exposures. And so, I'm realizing there's so many thoughts that I have. I'm just kind of running with this, but it's, stop
Do you
me
have
if
an
you need
overexuberance
to.
problem yourself?
I do. I get a little excited when I get the opportunity to share, and it's a ton of fun.
So do Julie and I. Everyone's used to that. We just like, woo, dogs, yay, let's talk about all of it.
Yes. And so, I think there's so many opportunities in that early learning that I think I don't think that we know enough to know how to pay attention to it quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a couple of people who, at various points in time have said, well, gosh, back when I was raising pups 20 years ago, we didn't have all these reactivity problems that we have right now. What's going on with the way that people are raising their dogs? And that really got me thinking about some of these factors. And I have to wonder, if we go back to the days when dog training didn't start until a little bit later, that dog training classes were really about going to a place where you are going to practice sit, come, down, and stay, and being primarily attentive to your handler. Mm-hmm. While I don't necessarily agree with all of the methods that were used in some of those training classes in a more traditional sense, we also avoided a lot of that conditioned arousal that I think is there for us now with the puppy play dates and, people taking puppies to dog park way too young of ages, and just all of those things that I think it's coming from a great place of wanting to socialize and to give those positive experiences, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily setting those pups up to have appropriate adult behaviors by the time they actually reach either adolescence or adulthood.
Okay, so if we make you king of the world, what do you want done? How are we going to perfectly socialize our puppies?
Well, first of all, I just have to thank you for making me king of the world. Let's start there.
You're welcome.
No. So in that perfect example, I think it's a matter of giving our pups a variety of experiences. I wouldn't want someone to walk away from this podcast saying, Dr. Pachel thinks it's terrible to go to puppy play groups. No, I don't think that's terrible at all. I think that's a great opportunity to have appropriate facilitated one-on-one, one-on-two play for short periods of time. Awesome. And we also need to be able to make sure that there's sometimes where we walk by other dogs and we don't say hi. Mm-hmm. And there are times where we experience the world just by kind of hanging out and watching it go by. And what I really want for a lot of these pups, if you think about what I think many of us are hoping for in an adult dog, is the ability for them to experience the world without significant amounts of fear, without being so overwhelmed or so overstimulated that they just can't even be in their environment and be present in that environment. And so I think that there's the variety of the experiences where sometimes it's play, sometimes it's quiet time, sometimes we, might even practice calling the puppies out of play, mm-hmm. so that they learn, it's not just up to you to decide when and if you want to be done, but we're practicing all of these skills, thinking about what's going to be necessary if we want that dog, riding politely in a vehicle or walking down the street without pulling toward every other dog or every other person. So practicing that whole range of experiences as puppies so that they're ready to perform that way and to engage in those behaviors as adults. That's what I think we're perhaps missing a little bit in the exuberance of positive reinforcement puppy raising.
Do you think that if a dog, for example, we're talking mostly about a dog's reaction to other dogs as being amped up in the result, do you think that kind of amping up then generalizes to other experiences, not just dogs? Do you think then it would translate to being overexuberant at the sight of children or people? Or, do dogs generalize this kind of thing, or is this something that's going to be more species specific, so to speak?
Most learning tends to start out as being very context dependent, and it's going to depend a little bit on the individual and sort of their, I guess, physiologic or genetic tendency towards exuberance in a lot of different ways. But I think that for a lot of those early experiences, it is going to be more individual. And yet, if the same pattern is being repeated across multiple contexts, we're much more likely to get that generalization happening. So that, and I don't think this, while we often talk about this as the dog specific thing, and I think that's where we see it the most, I think that there's also a pattern of the way that we as people interact with puppies, that if we're seeing every puppy going, ah! and we're squealing and we're rushing and we're doing all of this stuff, that's for us, but what is the puppy learning? Right. And so I do see that happens in a lot of different contexts, and it always, I find it fascinating when I'm visiting, whether it's other cities or other cultures, where perhaps people are a little bit more matter of fact about the fact that there are puppies and there are dogs in sort of public spaces. It's amazing that, people acknowledge and kind of smile at a dog, for example, but they're not rushing the puppy. It's not this over exuberance. So I think, back to your question, I don't think that puppies naturally are going to automatically generalize across all different circumstances. But if that's the way that those exposures are being structured, I think we run a dangerous course of that becoming sort of the way we respond to novelty or the way that we respond to social interactions in general.
I can think of 2 clients right now that with you describing all of this, I'm thinking that is probably a factor in why they are the way they are. Because great owners, totally on it, doing the socialization, making all the connections and doing all the stuff, and just everything was super exciting all the time. And probably we have got this whole conditioned excitement, arousal, yay, the world kind of stuff going on with these 2. And now they're pretty challenging adolescents because they're just so on all the time. They need their off switch.
Right. So what do you do with a challenging adolescent like that? How do you train it to have an off switch, so to speak?
Oh, great. Yeah, great question. And just like when we were talking in the previous podcast or in the previous episode about socializing and setting up appropriate circumstances and opportunities for exposure, to are we now having to specifically work on impulse control? Are we now having to specifically work on relaxation and developing that off switch? Do we now have to teach that? Because simply putting that animal into those environments and expecting them to habituate or just adapt to their surroundings isn't likely to happen. Mm-hmm. Their brain is telling them, no, this is a big deal. I had all of these formative experiences that told me to think this is huge. And so we really now have to reprogram to the best of our ability these other circuits. How do you kind of just hang out in a relax down while people go by or while dogs go by? Or how do you start to play a little bit and then respond to someone who's calling you out of play? If we're playing more like the go wild and settle type games. Or are we teaching dogs more like Zen style exercises where they really, really want that food in your hand, but we teach them offer the sit, focus on my eye contact, and take it gently. These are now specific skills. As soon as we identify that this is a pup, adolescent, or adult who's lacking in those particular areas, that's when we make the shift. That's when we say this is a pup who has a deficient skill set, and we're going to have to be intentional with how we are teaching those skills if we want this pup, adolescent, or adult to improve. So it's not going to be age dependent necessarily.
Right. When you were saying that, I was thinking it's interesting because when I'm working with dogs who tend to be perhaps fearful of the world, and in my little village, I really do live in a village, and we only have about 3,000 people. We can start near the end of the village and we'll sit on a park bench and we watch the world go by, and we get lots of treats as people come by. So my fearful dogs, I started at the very quiet end of town, and we slowly work towards the ice cream parlor and adding in, a little bit more excitement as we go along. But with my overstimulated dogs, I do exactly the same thing. We sit on a park bench and we start at the quiet end of town. And if somebody comes by, it's check in with the owner. So it's really funny to me that in so many ways, what I'm doing with both my fearful or traumatized dogs and my overstimulated dogs are much the same thing. It's all about feeling safe, feeling focused, feeling connected to my owner, and the world can go by and I'm okay. And so I think to me gives me a lot of hope that these dogs can all be, sort of brought back to normal with fairly simple techniques, but you have to understand the body language of your individual dog. So you know when to give the treat, when to do the focus, that kind of stuff. So it may be the same process, but it's individualized according to what that particular dog needs when, and not to push it. The temptation I find that I have to regulate myself as well as my owners is not to go too fast, too far.
You're absolutely right, Julie. And something that I wanted really just kind of interject within that, which is just to kind of tie this all together in I think a really important way based on what you just said, is that in both of those cases, what we're really talking about is perhaps an excessively strong emotional response, whether that happens to be fear or whether it's that level of exuberance, that excitement, that anticipation. In both cases, we're perhaps talking about a bit of a regulation of emotional arousal. And in many ways, and I love the way that you phrase that you're doing the same techniques or similar techniques. In both cases, we're basically trying to bring these pups a little bit back to the middle. In some cases, we're really trying to, to reframe that so they're thinking it's not scary, it's actually positive and safe. In other cases, it's not so exciting, it's just fine. Just bring it back to a little bit more neutral from either of those extremes. So I agree that we don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. It's being aware of what is the target, what is the focus, what are we actively trying to accomplish within those exposure sessions, so we can get that little micro adjustment of are we reinforcing the fearful pup at the moment it alerts to the stimulus so we can shift the emotional response? Or are we waiting for the more exuberant pup to notice and then check back in? They're disengaging. That little subtle difference is going to make or break whether or not we actually start to move the line a little bit. So I love that you said that way. Thank you.
That whole simple but not easy thing, because to most people, it looks like you're sitting on a bench feeding a dog treats. And you are. But it's that line, watching the behavior and catching that moment. That's the one.
And what I would say, too, is that even with dogs who aren't on either one of these spectrums, that's something that's important to do. I remember when our Bernese Mountain Dog Buckley was a puppy, and we went down to Wits, which is what everybody in Granville does. It's the ice cream parlor. In the summer, the entire village of 3,000 empties out to Wits, and every evening of the summer. You'd think we would all be much bigger than we are. But my husband was on a softball team, and he was talking to some of the softball members, and I realized Bucky was just sitting there. So I'm like, cool, this would be a great time to teach Buckley some focus. So that we sat there, and as people came by and he looked at me, he got a treat. This is not a dog that was either overstimulated or fearful. But what I really wanted him to understand was no matter what was going on, it's in your best interest to check in with me. And I really think that that's a valuable skill for any dog to learn, whether you have a behavior problem or not, because it may help to minimize a behavior problem or even prevent one from occurring. But that whole idea of just standing downtown or sitting on a bench and feeding your dog when he checks in with you is just a great thing to do, no matter who the dog is. At least that, in my experience, it has been that way.
I completely agree with you, Julie. And what I love about that is that it brings me back around to, Colleen, what you had asked, when I'm king of the world and I'm programming sort of how we're raising all these puppies, is I want them, for the majority of their experiences, I want them to think, no big deal.
Yes.
And then there are going to be some times where we say, it's playtime. Let's go. and we can get that exuberance, so we can kind of turn that switch on. And then in other cases, it's appropriate for that puppy to say, whoa, that's a big, scary truck, and I should probably not try to play with it. So I think that, there's going to be some fringe activities where it's appropriate to have a healthy degree of fear or avoidance and an appropriate level of exuberance. And if we have a dog that is truly well socialized, which I want to come back to in just a second, they have the ability to go in either direction. And they have the ability to move through those emotional states without getting stuck. And that, as we're talking both about sort of the trauma associated with perhaps inappropriate socialization or the lack of impulse control, in either case, what I really want to emphasize is that calling a dog well socialized is an outcome, not an intent. My goal is to socialize the dog, and I will know whether or not he was well socialized when we fast forward.
Yes.
But it's an outcome, and we don't always know in the moment exactly what any of our learners are learning, whether that's kids or dogs or cats or people.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly like being a parent.
Yes.
you just don't know until they reach adulthood. And even then you don't know. I mean, every once in a while you get little snippets that maybe things are going in the right direction with your kids, but you really, really don't know until the end. It's like going to the symphony, and you don't know if it was a good symphony until the last note is played. And
yes.
So, yeah.
Well, and here we are wrapping toward the end of our podcast with Dr. Pachel, and I think I know that these have been really fun. That's what I think. So here we are, and I can say these were well done episodes with Dr. Pachel. So thanks so much for coming on, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Really do.
Oh, you're certainly welcome. I love being a part of this. I love having the opportunity to not only just kind of share what each of us have learned in our own little windows, but to really engage in dialogue and kind of push the knowledge base in a lot of different ways. So thank you so much for the opportunity, both of you.
Well, we loved having you.
We did, and I will see you at the Midwestern Veterinary Conference next February. So,
yes. And if any of our listeners want to learn more about Dr. Pachel and the work he does, they can check out animalbehaviorclinic.net, which is the URL for his work site. So if you have questions and you want to learn more, that's where to go. We'll have that in the show notes.
Thanks for listening to Your Family Dog. Got questions? Interesting ideas? Colleen and Julie would love to hear them. Call 614-349-1661 or visit www.yourfamilydogpodcast.com to share your thoughts.